Good morning, everyone. We have the privilege of studying Parsha Pikudei this year. Pikudei is normally or very often juxtaposed and connected with Vayakel Pikudei, so we rarely get to look at the Pikudei part of Vayakel Pikudei, so it's a special opportunity to do that. And there's an entire group of scholarship of how do we see Pikudei? Is it its own unit? Is it sort of just a addendum to Vayakel? But we're not going to get into that today, this year, because Pikudei is on its own this year, and so we'll look at it that way. Of course, we find ourselves at the end of the book of Shemot, the last Parsha, but also at the end of the building project of the book of Shemot, i.e. the Mizbeach, i.e. the Mizbeach, i.e. the Mishkan, the building of the tabernacle the in the desert. And really it's the culmination of the whole second half of the book. But as we'll look at today, it might also be the culmination of both books both parts of the book, both the beginning of Shemot, which of course highlights and is the very exciting story of the Exodus of Egypt and the receiving of the Torah, and the second being the Mishkan. Sorry about that. Thank you for your patience. So as I was saying, really the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot, is divided into two sections. We have this section, the first half, which is the redemption from Egypt, and the culmination of the receiving of the Torah, which then segues us into the building of the Mishkan and everything that happens around that, the golden calf, obviously. And one of the features that we often don't think about is how connected are these? Is this just the chronological development of the people, or is there some sort of unit that is connected in the book of Shemot that gets tied through to the end of the book, right? And that's sort of what I want to approach this position from, or this thought from it, when we think about the Parsha, and when we think about the different components of the book of Shemot and really the end of the Parsha. Before we get to the end of the Parsha, let's just talk about what's in the Parsha. So the Parsha describes the construction, the final construction, and the inauguration of the Mishkan, in particular, the assembly, the putting in all the different items and utensils, and the building of, and the dressing of the Kohen, and all those different pieces that we would expect in terms of building the Mishkan. It is really interesting to note, this is sort of just a broader topic. And this is a separate premise. And if we don't mention it, I'd be remiss. So I want to talk about it. There's so much dedicated to the intricacies of building the Mishkan. And I think, Chuck, you may have said this at the beginning, not to, maybe I'm wrong, that these are not the most exciting parshiot in the Torah. And I'll let you
You should have
rebut.
stopped the recording just before you said that and accused me.
My
Yes,
apologies.
I
My
was the one who
apologies.
said that.
It's not Chuck, but I think it's a really important piece. And we talked about it at the time that number one, like that's okay. And number two, that we should endeavor to try to find components in this story that really speak more writ large about our connection to God, our building or crafting of our spiritual lives in our daily lives, and our sort of building our own mishkans, our own experiences with God in our everyday. One of those details that's really interesting to think about is the debate between Moshe and Bezalel about how to actually build the Mishkan. I don't mean like what to do in terms of do this, do that. But when they came to actually building the Mishkan, Moshe is of the opinion, according to the Midrash, that you should build it as God commanded it. So what's the first thing you should build? The ark. And what's the next thing you should do is the inner equipment, and then build out, right? Because the instructions for building the Mishkan start in and work its way out. Bezalel says no. First, you got to build the walls, and you got to build the tent, and you got to do all the other stuff. And then inside, you put the Aron. Inside, you put the this. Inside, you put the that. Now, what's unbelievable is, what does Moshe say to that? He's convinced it's one way. He says, well, if that's what God commanded you, Bitzalel, that you have the shade, the oversight of the Almighty, I agree. I admit withdraw my comment. Right, Moshe, the great Moshe Rabbeinu, the great master teacher, a leader, the supreme leader of the Jewish people, right away concedes when he understands that Bezalel is correct instead of digging in his heels, which is unbelievable. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, well, what's the point of this debate, right? What's behind this switch of the process? So you could just say practically, right? One is, the machshava is the intent. The intent is for the aron. The intent is for the menorah. The intent is for the shulchan. But you can't have a temple without, the walls. You can't have, so just practically, I build my house not for my exterior walls. I build my house for my kitchen. I build my house for my dining room. But I'm not going to put the dining room table in until there's somewhere to put it. So you could just say it's practical. But of course, as we try to plumb the depths a little bit deeper, there's got to be something more here. And perhaps one of the components to think about is the process here, right? If you think that building the Mishkan is just about building the ark, the pinnacle of the experience of the Mishkan is just about having that incredibly intense, real, vivid relationship with the Almighty that is typified by the Aron and the Kaporet, the Kruvim on top of it, the place which channels God's presence in the world. If you think you just jump to that and that's it, right, then you're mistaken. Right? What Bezalel says is no, every component that leads to that needs to be the case. Number one, that means things need to build and develop slowly, right? The preparation is important. It's an important thing to sort of think about this time of year as we are ensconced, as we are enmeshed, as we are taken up by our Pesach preparations, right? That those preparations isn't just a practical way in which we get to the Seder and we have food, but that is itself the container that will hold the holiness of the pinnacle of the Aron Kodesh, which in this case is the Seder night and the Pesach experience. Without that, we won't be able to do that, right? There's that the preparation has holiness. Preparation is essential. That's the divine way of building spirituality in this world, number one. And number two, right? The boundaries, the outer walls represent sort of the general character traits, the midot, the derech eretz, the proper conduct, the personality and character traits that underscore a person being a human being a mensch, being an appropriate person. You can't just have a our own experience and then be a jerk, right? You can't come to shul, have a really special davening, and on your way out knock over three people because you're in a rush to get to kiddush, right? You can't be a holy roller in the pews and sort of forget what you do when you leave shul, right? Part of what Bitzalel and Moshe, maybe this might be like very apropos. Moshe is this very humble, totally connected to God, this very pure soul. He doesn't understand that there could be that sort of bifurcation. So of course you build our own first. Says Bezalel, no. If you want to build a place for God in the world, you got to start with building a good foundation, with derech eretz, with appropriate conduct. Everything that you do that will lead to the foundation, literally build the floor that the Aron will sit on. And so that is the story we see that unfolds in Vayakal Pikudei in the actual building of it. Yeah.
Does this kind of pass along to why many people ascribe such kedusha just to the retaining walls at Tar Bayit, effectively the kotel? I mean, it's sort of the same idea. That it's a foundational structure.
So it's part yes and no. Obviously, the Temple Mount walls have holiness, right? Because they're part of the temple structure. The temple structure is holy, so it's a piece of the holiness. And part of the conversation about the holiness of the walls has to do with the technical reality of demarcating space for the temple. And do the walls represent sort of the outer boundary or the inner boundary, right? Are the walls sort of the outer or the inner? But I'm not sure if what I'm saying right now it's that Moshe would say they don't have holiness, and Bezalel says they do. I think everyone would agree their holiness is. The question just is one a secondary holiness? You know, is it a holiness in of itself, or is it a holiness, a secondary holiness? Is the walls holy only because they're going to hold the ark? Or as Bezalel teaches, there's a holiness found in the preparation, there's a holiness found in the foundation, there's a holiness in developing the foundational behaviors and ethics and chesed and menschlichkeit and character traits, that is not just then you're able to hold the ark, or that it comes from holding the ark, but it's sort of the prerequisite, and the requirement for that. So, yeah, Lee.
I just wanted to go back for a moment to the debate between Moshe and Bezalel. I mean, if we're talking about practicality, it's more likely that all of these things were occurring in parallel, unless we assume that Bezalel was making everything himself. Okay, so I imagine that there was a group that's making the curtains, there's a group that's making the planks, there's a group that's making all the other parts that are going to go into it. And then when we get to the part where Moshe actually assembles it, he assembles it according to Moshe's opinion. So it's actually put
Not
up.
what we see. That's not what we see here. Hold on, I'll bring you the.
When we look at where what we see in terms of how things are constructed or how they're erected.
Well, I'm less worried about like how they're fabricated in the factory. I'm imagining this, illustrious factory. Obviously, that's not the case. I mean more about how they're assembled.
How it's actually erected and put together.
And by the way, just as an aside, you could do it both ways, meaning when they built the temple, right? The Gemara talks about this. When they built the temple, there's a debate about did they put up partitions between the Holy of Holies, like sort of the outline on the site. Partitions, I imagine almost like, those like curtain dividers that like you can slide across that have the metal frames.
Yeah.
Like, did they put that and they built around that? Or not, right? And the Gemara is trying to prove about Kedusha Shaita, Kedusha Lavo. What's the nature of the holiness on the Temple Mount? That's irrelevant. The point here is just in terms, there are models where they could have like set up temporary demarcations, put the Holy of Holies in, and then sanctified the temple or built the Mishkan around the Holy of Holies. That seems to not be what happens. What happens is they build all the different things and then they put in it the Aron. They put in it the right? Just last week, we read all about like Vayachabor. They connected it. Vayas. They build together all the different sides. And then in this week's Parsha, just right? And by the way, after everything is built, they put in the Aron.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Look at chapter 40.
Okay.
Right? They brought in the Heveta et HaShulchan. They brought in the table. Natata et HaMizbeach. They brought in the right? They brought in all the stuff.
Right.
Meaning, I assume that means they brought into the structure that already existed. And even in the even in 17, 18. Vayaka Moshe at Hamishkan, Moshe erects the Mishkan and all the different pieces, and he puts the tent and the covering, all of that. Vayikach, Vayitain et Edut, Vayasem Bada, Vayitain Kaporet, Vayaveh et Haron el Mishkan. He brings the ark into the Mishkan. Vayasem et Parochet, and he puts Kaporet. And he does this and he does that, and then he puts this and he puts that. So it definitely seems like he's putting it in like this, right? It exists. Which leads me to the end of which leads me to what we want to talk about today. So the last verses of the Mishkan, of the book, seem to be verse 33. Vayakim et hachatzer saviv Mishkan. They set up the courtyard around the Mishkan and the Mizbeach. Vayiten et masach shar hachatzer. Then they finish all of the work. Moshe et kol et ha'avodah. Moshe finishes the work, right? It would seem that would be a nice place to end the book, right? He finishes the building progress, but we get a couple more verses. What are the couple more verses? Vayichas Hanan et Ol Moed ukvod Hashem alei et Mishkan. The temple, the cloud filled the tent of the meeting, right? The Mishkan, and God's presence appeared and filled in the tabernacle, right? So that seems to fit nicely, also, right?
Yeah.
That's what.
Now someone's moving in.
Yes, and we could say even more, right? This is what was missing. Remember when the people sinned with the golden calf, God's presence left them. Now God's presence has come back. Right? And by the way, we had the debate between Rashi and the Ramban. This is sort of irrefutable evidence that at least part of the Mishkan is replicating Har Sinai, right? Because this is the same sort of language, the Kvod Hashem and this and that. But this is where things get a little bit different. Moshe couldn't go into the tent of the meeting, to the Ol Moed, Kishachen alav hanan ukvod Hashem alei mishkan, because God's presence was blocking Moshe, right? Does Moshe go up on Har Sinai?
He goes up, but he can't go into the cloud until God asks him in.
He can't go into the cloud till God asks him in. Meaning, Vayal Moshe in chapter 24 in Exodus, in Shemot, verse 15 and 16. Vayal Moshe al Har, Moshe arrives up the mountain. Vayichas Hanan et Har, and the cloud covers the mountain. Same language. Vayishkon Kvod Hashem al Har Sinai. And then Moshe gets called into the Vayikra el Moshe. Moshe gets called on the seventh day. And then verse 18, Vayavo Moshe b'toch Hanan. Moshe comes within the cloud. Right? So it seems to parallel what we're talking about here, except Moshe is Lo Yachol Moshe Lavo Ol Moed Kishachen Alav Hanan. Says Lee. That's fine. That's what we expect. Moshe needs to be called in. That's just like Har Sinai, right? Ukvod Hashem alei mishkan, because God's presence covered or took up, settled in the temple, in the tabernacle, and Moshe needs to be called in. Ubalot Hanan me'al hamishkan, and when the cloud would raise up from above the Mishkan, Yisub b'nei Yisrael b'chol ma'aseihem, the people would travel to all their journeys. Ve'im lo yaleh Hanan lo yisu ad yo haloto. If the cloud didn't lift up, they wouldn't travel until it lifted. Ki Anan Hashem al Mishkan yomam, because God's cloud was on the Mishkan by day. Ve'eshtia laila bo, and the night it was transformed into a fire, Leinei kol beit Yisrael b'chol ma'aseihem, to the view of all the house of Israel through all their journeys. Chazak, chazak, v'nir chazek, end of the book. Are we missing something at the end of this book? This is not a trick, Lee. You just said it.
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Moshe is not called into the tabernacle, meaning after Har Sinai, Moshe gets called up. Moshe is not called up. Moshe seems to be barred from entering the Mishkan, right? Sort of a sour note. And then we get all this travel instructions here. Make sure don't forget your passport. Only travel when the cloud is up and the cloud is down, right? It seems to be sort of the last three. I have two questions. Number one, the last three verses here seems to be not the way to end. If I was grading this as an English paper, this would not fit, right? It's a totally new topic. What's going on here? And number two, Moshe seems, Ukfor Hashem Alei Mishkan, beautiful. God's presence rests with the Jewish people again, but Moshe's not invited in. What's going on? Now, Lee, I see you're already looking at the answer. Let's hold on one second for everyone else. Even through Zoom, Lee, I can see it in your eyes.
Yeah, I know, because I remembered from before.
This kind of
So the
foreshadows.
first, what?
This kind of
Chuck?
foreshadows not Moshe not being able to enter Eretz Yisrael at the end of the journey.
Maybe, but I'm gonna take it a slightly different direction. So first of all, we see the beautiful sort of connection to Har Sinai, the recreation of Har Sinai, the Anan, the cloud is here. Lee, what's the answer to our question that Moshe seems to be excluded from the Mishkan? Is this really such a sour moment?
Oh, it's just not in Vayikra. I mean, it's not
Right.
out.
Says Lee, 1 second. Don't make such a mountain out of a molehill, Rabbi. We just turned the page, right? Vayikra literally is Vayikra. They call him Moshe, right? What happens the next Parsha? Vayikra el Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem elav mi'ol moed lemor. God speaks to Moshe and calls to him from the tent of the meeting, meaning hold your horses. Don't bury Moshe yet, right? Moshe just hasn't been called yet, right? And what ultimately then is the most important piece to point out is that there's a parallel here between Har Sinai and the Mishkan, and that transcends the end of Shemot, right? We have the Anan covering the Har, we have the cloud covering the mountain, and we have the cloud covering the Mishkan. We have God's presence descending on the mountain, and we have God's presence filling the Mishkan. We have Moshe waiting to be called on top of the mountain. We have Moshe being told he can't answer because God's presence is there. And then turn the page to Vayikra 1:1. God calls Moshe, just like God called Moshe on the top of Har Sinai. Moshe enters the cloud. Moshe enters the Mishkan, just like happens in both places, on Har Sinai and in the Mishkan. And God speaks to Moshe and gives commands. God speaks to Moshe and gives commands. So there's a beautiful
And also
flow.
there's a fire on Sinai, and there's a fire on the very last pasuk in this chapter.
You're right. We're told that this cloud is either fire or a cloud, just like Har Sinai is a fire or a cloud, right? So first of all, there's a beautiful continuum that's presented here. Shemot doesn't just abruptly end on this sour note. It sets the tone for Vayikra. By the way, what's the day that Vayikra starts? The first day of Nisan. What day is this? The first day of Nisan. So it's the same day, right? It's telling two parts of the story. Vayikra Shemot ends. Vayikra begins with sort of an arrow to Shemot, to Vayikra, from Shemot to Vayikra, right? So the question sort of gets refined. Why does the Torah then stop the story, or stop the Sefer, stop the book in the middle of the story? Like, why don't we get the Vayikra in Shemot, right? Lee, you're going to tell me it's in Vayikra. I'm going to ask you, why is it in Vayikra? Why isn't it in Shemot? Or if the whole point of this is to recreate what the Jewish people saw and experienced and then lost with the golden calf, how come we don't get the full conclusion of the story in Shemot?
I guess you could say that if you wanted to emphasize that you're going to emphasize the parallel with Sinai versus emphasizing the fact that what God is about to tell him has to do with what they talk about in Vayikra.
Yeah, but I'm not sure we have to have like a limit on how many times God can call Moshe. It happens quite a lot, right? When Vayikra could start with Vayidaber, and God could call Moshe.
I assume it's God that's calling Moshe when he has something he wants to tell Moshe.
Right, and it's at the same time. So I think there's probably a little bit more here than just that. So on the one hand, we see our understanding that Vayikra is a logical continuation. The continuum on the continuum of the Shemot story, right? Number one. However, it doesn't totally answer our question about Shemot, because what's still at the end of the book of Shemot that seems to be out of order? The parking instructions, the travel instructions. The fact that the cloud is there, we already established that's an essential feature of recreating Sinai, of recapturing what was lost by the golden calf. But I need to know, when to walk and when to sit. It's like the divine, what are those things called? Signal, like the divine traffic light. All right, everyone pack up. Everyone, that's a detail. Why is that sort of caught in the web of the end of the book of Shemot, right? So it doesn't have to do with Vayikra. What does it really have to do with? What does this have to do with? Their travels in the desert, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the beginning of Vayikra, I'm sorry, beginning of Bamidbar, we actually see these verses almost intentionally continued or repeated. Bamidbar Paraktet, we're told the same thing, that Yisub and Israel, the Jewish people, would travel based on God. Depending on how the cloud was, this is what they would do. And if the cloud would travel, they would travel. And if not, not. Right?
Right.
Right. So, hey, we already had this information. Right. And so what's interesting here is that these final verses clearly belong in the book of Bamidbar, as they involve the Jewish people's journey in the desert, right? And has to do with the day that the Mishkan is established, that Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So apparently, Sefer Shemot concludes these three verses, these special travel instructions, directly result from the Anan, the cloud being with them on the Mishkan, and then what they're going to do with that, meaning in Bamidbar. So what our analysis sort of uncovered so far is 2 points. These last 5 verses point to 2 different books and 2 different topics. One, Vayikra, God's calling Moshe and the laws that are in Vayikra. And number 2, the description of how the people travel in the desert in accordance with God's wishes and the accordance of the Anan, the cloud, whether it's up or whether it's down, which is directly continued throughout the book of Bamidbar. And so essentially, what we see over here is that the structure of Shemot ends with 2 sort of pointers into the next 2 books, one in Bamidbar and one to Vayikra. And lest you think that the Torah is arranged only chronologically, Bamidbar takes place beginning Rosh Chodesh Nisan, when the Mishkan is built, right? We have that explicitly. And Vayikra begins Bayom Hashmini, takes place on this time from when the Mishkan is set up. So they're actually, the story continues in 2 books, but they're paralleled, meaning Vayikra is largely and this is sort of a schematic of all of Vayikra, but Vayikra is largely laws. There are only two really major stories in Vayikra. One is, just for some Bikiyas, some knowledge, one is the story of the Mikalel, the one who curses God, and the other is the story of the Mikoshesh Eitzim. No, I'm sorry, the other one is Nadav and Avihu. Mikoshesh Eitzim is not there. Um, and Vayikra and Bamidbar is almost entirely stories, right?
Yes.
So you have these two sort of pointers. And this ultimately ties the end of Shemot in a very elegant way. Why in a very elegant way? What's the plan if we think about the long stretch for the Jewish people at the beginning of Shemot? Leave Egypt to receive the Torah, right? Moses told that right away. What's the point of leaving Egypt? Tavdun and Halokim al Harazeh, serve God, receive the Torah, and travel. What's the goal of leaving Egypt?
To eventually get to
To the land of Israel. Can we tell all of those stories in one book? Presumably no, because they represent separate ideas. They're separate motifs, they're separate chapters. So how does Shemot end? Shemot ends very cleverly with an allusion to the Mishkan taking the place of Har Sinai, with the restoration of God's presence and the apparatus to receive more of the commands, i.e., Vayikra, what God tells Moshe in the book of Vayikra, and also with the travel instructions of how to get to the land of Israel. We're not going to tell the whole story of getting to the land of Israel. That's very long. But at least Shemot ends with a taste of this is how it's going to happen. This is how the people are going to leave, right? It pulls together both themes of God's original plan in Shemot. Granted, the plans don't go exactly as planned. Pharaoh says no, we get 10 plagues. The Jewish people sin by the golden calf. We need the Mishkan. There are things that take the Jewish people awry. God's plan, though, ultimately comes to a culmination with these 5 verses. And then we start thinking about, well, what's the point of these two separate stories, the book of Vayikra and the book of Bamidbar? If the Mishkan itself is explained as the opportunity for God to approach humanity, or more importantly, the opportunity for the Jewish people to approach God. So how do you do that? All of Vayikra is about how you achieve holiness, right? That's why it's called, the rabbis don't call it Vayikra, they call it Torah Kohanim, the Torah of the priests. It doesn't mean the Kohanim who duchen in the temple. It means the Jewish people who are trying to approach God, to engage with God. That's why Vayikra we're told about the opportunity to bring sacrifices to engage God. That's why Vayikra talks about where you're allowed to be and where you're not allowed to be when you're ritually impure in the temple, right? That's why God's presence requires Yom Kippur every year, right? To atone for the people. That's why we are told about different types of holiness in Vayikra. Vayikra tells us about Kedushat Adam, the holiness of the person, right? That's the whole Parsha Kedoshim. The Kedusha of the Zman, of the time. That's where we get Emor and all the holidays. All the moments in time in which we mark holiness. And of course, we talk about the holiness of location, of Makom, right? We have all of the Bahar part, which is Shemitah and Yovel, and the holiness of the land of Israel. We obviously have the holiness of the Mishkan, and what, God forbid, happens when you transgress that holiness, right? That's the whole story of Shmini and Achrimot, and what happens with Aaron's children, right? All of the book of Vayikra is supporting the supporting message, the mitzvot, of how you live a life when God has engaged with you, when God chooses to live within the people, or more importantly, when the people opt to live in relation with God. And then secondarily, Bamidbar isn't just the story of how they make their way to Israel. There's Bamidbar is how does the Jewish camp operate, travel when the Shekhinah, when the divine presence raises the entire camp of the Jewish people to a higher level, when God, as it were, travels with the people, right? The formulation, the formation, the entire process of how they camp and how they travel that is all of what Bamidbar and Naso is all about, is determined because God's presence is with the people. And when the Anan and when the cloud lifts, they have to be ready to travel, right? Shlach,
Mhm.
Korach is about the generation that doesn't enter the land of Israel, meaning why things went wrong. It should either be they do or they don't get in. And we end with Balak and Pinchas, which is all sort of the 40th year as the people are about to go into Israel, right? But Midbar ends on the precipice of the land of Israel because that's the continuation of Shemot. And Devarim, the last book of the Torah, is just Moshe's preparation for that moment. So if we take a step back, what's encompassed in the last 5 verses of Shemot is a blueprint for the rest of the Torah, right? Bereshit is the story of humanity and the Jewish family. Shemot is the formulation of the Jewish nation with 2 goals: serve God with godliness, live with God in your midst, and enter the land of Israel. Travel through life with God. And that points to 2 books: Vayikra for Project 1, Bamidbar for Project 2. Now, it doesn't go as planned always, right? This is always the challenge when we have humanity, when we are part of the process, when we are part of the plan. The people don't end up in the land of Israel in Bamidbar, right? They sin. But that's because of the stories in Bamidbar that they don't make it. Right? And so you basically have in one day, on the Rosh Chodesh Nisan, in one day, you have the culmination of these 3 books, or the nexus, the launching point of these 3 books. It's the end of Shemot, it's the beginning of Vayikra, the beginning of Bamidbar, and really the script or the blueprint for the rest of Jewish history, right? Or at least the rest of the Torah history. And by the way, just as an aside, as we read that this week, we read that on the day before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which is the most important Rosh Chodesh, which is an important first month. It's the Chodesh, right? Because it highlights all of these pieces. And all of this is taking place on the first anniversary of the Jewish people leaving Egypt. It took them a year to figure all this out, but sort of after that first year, I'm sorry, not on the first, on the approaching the first anniversary of them leaving Egypt. They obviously leave Egypt on the 14th at night to the 15th, right? But this is the Nisan before that, in the month that will be their first anniversary, 11 months or so, 11 and a half months from when they left Egypt. So what we see in the text of the last 5 verses or so of Exodus of Shemot is really a fulfillment or a nod to the fulfillment, the culmination of the process that is the finalization of the 2 goals of God. The people leaving Egypt, serving God, living with God, becoming servants of God. Number 1. And number 2, the trajectory to get back to the land of Israel, to travel with God and to create a Jewish society in Israel.
With some tweaking, could
Yeah.
have the order been reversed between Vayikra and Bamidbar, basically to continue with?
No, because the whole point, you can't, the Vayikra is about how you cultivate holiness, right? That's the continuation of Sinai. That's continuation of the first goal. The second goal is to travel to the land of Israel with that holiness. Chronologically, that wouldn't make sense.
Okay.
Or it's not actually chronologically, but if you conceptually, logically, that wouldn't make sense.
Okay. That's why I included a few tweaks, but
Yeah. No, but I think fundamentally, the mission of Vayikra, right? And this is a Vayikra conversation, but we'll mention it now. Vayikra gets a bad rap because it's referred to as Torah Kohanim, the Torah of the priests, but doesn't mean the Kohanim, those that descend from Aaron. It means the Jewish people, those that have the opportunity, or really anyone who has the opportunity to administer with God. Right? So much of Vayikra is not just relegated to the laws of the priests. It's holidays, it's holiness, it's sacrifices, it's Kedushat Zman, Kedushat Makom, location holiness, right? All of that, Kedoshim, Bahar, just think about what's in those things. They're not about the priests, right? There are a couple of chapters here in Emor about what the priests can't do, but that's it, right? So it's really about how do you live a life connected to that holiness. That has to come first. But Midbar is about traveling with that holiness. But you got to have that holiness to be able to travel. We need to make a new word up. Chronologically, but not based on time, but based on conception or thematic. Themologically. Conceptuologically.
Thematically.
Yeah, but anyways. With that, we'll end.
Okay.
I just want to put a pitch in particular for some of the upcoming classes that we have, and to highlight we have an excellent opportunity to learn with Rabbi Menachem Leibtag a week from Thursday. He is a seminal educator, thinker, and teacher in Tanakh, also an excellent presenter. I've also talked to Tzion. His class will be postponed or moved to not conflict with this. So we're very excited, and I just want to encourage people to make it, put it on their schedule, and be there.
Already done.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right, we'll see everyone later. Take care.